The dust along the horizon shimmered in the late afternoon sun, curling upward like smoke rising from a secret fire, a sign of arrival that made Boone Carter's heart hammer with anticipation. For months he had lived on words written in careful handwriting, on promises folded neatly into envelopes, on dreams painted by a stranger's ink that he believed would soon be flesh and breath before him. He had studied every letter until the edges frayed, memorized the soft descriptions of laughter, gardens, and gentle wishes that seemed to come from a woman destined to heal the empty corners of his life. And now, as the wagon wheels groaned to a halt at the trading post, everything he thought he knew trembled like a fragile glass about to shatter. The door swung open, and time bent strangely in that moment, stretching like a thread pulled too tight. He expected timid eyes, a girl with shy curls and delicate fingers that might tremble when they touched his hand. Instead, a woman stepped down who looked like she had walked through storms and refused to bow. Her hair was darker, drawn back with the severity of someone who valued strength over vanity. Her hands bore the calluses of work, her gaze glowed with a fierce, unyielding green fire. Nothing about her matched the picture he had built in his heart, and yet, against all reason, something inside him tightened with a pull he could not deny. "Boone Carter," she said, her voice carrying the clarity of steel meeting stone. She did not wait for courtesy, did not hide behind a veil of shyness. "I'm Ruby, not Violet. Ruby." The name fell like a stone into deep water, sending ripples into the world he thought was settled. The ground itself seemed to shift beneath his boots, though he stood firm, and the hum of voices around the post dimmed to nothing against the power of that single revelation. He had expected one destiny, and instead been thrust into another, one that smelled not of rosewater, but of earth, leather, and hidden storms. Her presence was both disarming and strangely healing, as though her fire might burn away lies, but leave the truth glowing warmer than any dream he had ever held. He had no answer at first, only questions spiraling faster than he could catch. Where was Violet? Why had this stranger come in her place? Why did the air itself seem to quiver between them, alive with a current he could neither welcome nor resist? The photograph, the letters, the months of waiting, all of it twisted into a puzzle whose pieces refused to fit. And yet, in Ruby's gaze, there was something undeniable, a force both fierce and tender, promising that whatever path had been altered was not a mistake, but the unveiling of something deeper. He realized then that life had shifted in a single heartbeat, in the moment her boots touched the dirt beside his wagon. There would be no simple explanations, no easy return to the plans he had built. The woman who stood before him was carrying secrets heavy enough to bend her shoulders, but also a strength that lit the air between them like lightning before rain. And though his voice, when it came, was rough and uncertain, his soul already knew. This was not an accident. This was the beginning of a story that would test every vow, every wound, every hope he had ever carried. So let your heart lean in as the horizon opens wider. Let curiosity draw you closer, because within this tale lies a journey not just of betrayal and truth, but of unexpected tenderness, of healing born from storms, and of love arriving in the form no one had dared to imagine. Stay with this story. Share your thoughts in the quiet of the comments below, and if it speaks to your heart, let your support flow with a simple like or a gentle subscribe, so that together we keep kindling these fires of hope and romance. And now, as Boone takes his first breath in a world turned upside down, let us step with him into the unfolding of a love destined to rise from the most unlikely of beginnings, carrying us forward toward revelations that wait like stars beyond the twilight sky. Ruby's gaze never faltered as she shouldered her satchel, the weight of it settling against her like the burdens she had carried for far too long. Her presence shifted the air, filling the trading post with a gravity that pulled Boone into her orbit, whether he willed it or not. Behind them, men carried sacks of grain. Horses stamped impatient hooves against dry earth, the chatter of commerce rising and falling like waves. But for Boone, the world had narrowed to the woman who had just unfastened the seams of his future with a single name. "You've been waiting for Violet," she said, her tone steady, her eyes sharp as though daring him to deny it. He nodded, though the words caught like thorns in his throat. He had built his days around those letters, carried them close as a man carries prayers, and now this stranger claimed them as her own. Ruby stepped closer, her scent faintly of cedar and wild fields after rain, healing in its earthiness, comforting in ways the sweetness of perfume never could be. "It was me," she continued. "Every word you read, every promise, every dream you thought belonged to her, those were mine." The confession landed with the weight of truth and betrayal entwined. Boone's chest tightened, his breath uneven, and yet in that same moment he felt an inexplicable relief, as though the voice behind the ink had finally taken form. He saw the tiredness in her eyes, the nights etched into the faint shadows beneath them, the guilt she carried like chains. But he also saw her strength, the fierce determination of someone who had borne the storms alone and still chosen to stand tall. He realized then that while he had been waiting for one woman, it was another who had been weaving threads into his heart without his knowing. Ruby's hand curled tightly around the strap of her satchel, knuckles white as she spoke. "Violet never wanted to marry you. Not from the start. Our father's debts chained us, left us with nothing but desperation. She was 17, frightened, and I thought I could fix everything. I thought I could find her a good man, someone who would keep her safe, someone who would care for her." Her words cracked slightly, though her face held firm. "So I wrote as if I were her. And in those letters I gave you the best of myself, because she had none of it left to give." Boone turned toward the wagon, the familiar creak of wood grounding him even as the truth ripped through the foundations of his life. He remembered the gentle phrases in those letters, the laughter described, the shared secrets, the prayers whispered across miles. They had been the soul of someone alive, someone real, and now he stood face to face with her. The betrayal burned, yes, but underneath the sting was the undeniable pulse of recognition. It was her voice, her spirit, her heart that had walked with him through those months of waiting. Not Violet's. Never Violet's. The silence stretched between them, taut as a rope between cliffs, and he could feel his world swaying with the weight of choice. Ruby lifted her chin, bracing herself as though ready to be struck by his anger, yet beneath her fire he caught a flicker of vulnerability that pierced him deeper than any blade. And in that vulnerability, in the rawness of her honesty, he felt something stirring that was more than anger, more than shock. It was the beginning of a new kind of knowing, a recognition that sometimes lies were born not of malice, but but of sacrifice, of a desperate attempt to shield love from ruin. He looked at her, really looked, and the photograph of Violet he had memorized dissolved like ash on the wind. Ruby was no shadow of her sister. She was something else entirely, unyielding, radiant, scarred and strong, a force that seemed carved from the same earth he tilled with his own hands. And as the setting sun caught the gold threads in her green eyes, Boone realized that the story of his life was not unraveling. It was only beginning to weave into something new. The ache of betrayal still throbbed, but alongside it rose a tenderness he had not expected, a warmth that whispered of healing yet to come. He felt the weight of secrets pressing between them, unspoken dangers that trembled just beyond her lips. But he also felt the quiet pull of destiny urging him forward into the unknown. And so, with the dust of the trading post swirling around their feet and the horizon stretching wide with possibility, Boone's voice came low, rough, but steady. "Then tell me everything." Ruby's eyes softened for the first time, the fire within them flickering with something gentler, something almost fragile. She nodded once, and together they turned toward the waiting wagon, the path to his ranch opening like a chapter none of them had written, but both were destined to live. The journey into truth, betrayal, and an unexpected tenderness had only just begun, carrying them deeper into a story that would test the very boundaries of trust and love. The wagon creaked beneath their weight as they set off from the trading post, the road stretching like a ribbon into the dimming light of evening. Silence clung between them, but it was not the silence of strangers. It pulsed, alive, filled with unspoken words, and the heavy press of questions neither dared yet to release. Boone held the reins loosely, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, but every breath reminded him of the woman beside him, her quiet strength, the scent of sun-warmed earth that seemed to follow her, the way her presence shifted the air around him, as though the world itself leaned closer to listen. Ruby sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, but the tension in her posture betrayed the storm within her. From time to time, her gaze flickered toward him, and when she thought he wasn't watching, the hardness in her expression softened into something weary, almost tender. Each time their eyes met by accident, a spark passed between them, sharp and undeniable, like flint striking steel. And though Boone told himself to remain guarded, to keep his heart from tumbling into the abyss, she had opened with her confession, he could not stop the warmth that unfurled in his chest, slow and healing, as if her very presence was stitching something broken inside him. The road wound into rolling hills, the sound of horse hooves steady against the earth. When at last the ranch came into view, the modest house standing proud against the backdrop of the valley, Boone's throat tightened. He had spent weeks preparing it for Violet. New curtains hung with care, shutters freshly painted, wildflowers planted by the steps. Every detail had been chosen with the image of a gentle, timid bride in mind. Now, as Ruby's green eyes studied the home with measured silence, the preparations seemed foolish, like offerings left at the wrong altar. Yet when she spoke, her voice carried no mockery, only a quiet awe that slipped through the cracks of her guarded composure. "You built this yourself?" she asked, her gaze tracing the porch, the hand-carved beams, the windows glowing with the warmth of lamplight within. "Most of it," Boone replied, tying off the reins and stepping down. He turned to help her, his hand extended, though a part of him braced for rejection. Ruby hesitated for only a moment before placing her palm in his. Her hand was strong, calloused, yet warm, and when she stepped down beside him, she did not pull away as quickly as she might have. The contact lingered, their closeness charged with an intimacy neither had chosen, but both felt deep in the marrow of their bones. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and the sincerity in her tone pierced him more deeply than any praise he had ever received. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, even the whisper of the wind seemed to pause, as though giving them permission to simply stand there, hand in hand, in the fragile warmth of a moment that could not last. When Ruby finally drew her hand away, a flush rose faintly across her neck, and Boone felt the emptiness left by her absence like a cold wind against bare skin. They moved toward the house, the porch creaking beneath their steps. But before he could open the door, Ruby stopped abruptly. The fading sunlight caught in her eyes, and for the first time since she had stepped off the wagon, uncertainty flickered there, tender and human. "Before we go inside," she said, her voice hushed but firm, "you need to understand. After tonight, nothing will be the same. The truths I carry will change the way you see me, the way you see everything, and once they're spoken, there is no turning back." Boone's breath tightened in his chest. He wanted to resist, to shield himself from the storm she promised, but something deeper pulled him forward. He stepped closer, closing the space between them until her shadow mingled with his. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," he said, the words spilling out before reason could stop them. Her eyes widened slightly, softening the steel that usually guarded them, and for the first time Boone saw her falter. Vulnerability trembled at the edges of her composure, and it struck him as more beautiful than any painted portrait, more real than any dream he had clung to in lonely nights. "You don't know what you're saying," Ruby whispered, her voice breaking against the weight of her secrets. "Don't I?" he murmured, his hand hovering near hers, though not yet touching, drawn by a force he could neither explain nor resist. "Maybe I'm tired of living in letters and photographs. Maybe I want something real." The air between them thickened, charged with a possibility that felt both dangerous and inevitable. For a long, aching moment, neither moved, their breaths mingling, hearts beating in rhythms too loud to ignore. Then Ruby pulled back, her expression hardening once more, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "Be careful what you wish for, Boone Carter, because the truth I carry isn't simple. It's blood and betrayal. And once you hear it, the world you thought you knew will be gone." Her warning hung heavy in the twilight, but beneath it was the unmistakable tremor of something more, a longing perhaps, or the first fragile roots of trust. And though shadows crept across the valley and night began to gather, Boone felt the faint glow of hope flicker within him, warm and healing, as though even in the face of secrets and storms something new was being born. He opened the door to his home, not knowing that by stepping across the threshold together they were crossing into a future neither could escape, where danger and desire would weave their fates into one unbreakable thread. Inside the ranch house, the air carried the scent of cedar and hearthstone, the faint sweetness of flowers. Boone had planted near the porch, drifting in through the open window. The room, with its hand-carved furniture and warm lamplight, seemed to embrace them both, though the weight of unspoken truths pressed heavier than the walls themselves. Ruby's eyes moved across the space, cataloguing every detail: the stone fireplace set for an evening fire, the table laid for two, the curtains chosen with quiet care. Her fingers trailed over the back of a chair, lingering as though she could feel the hope woven into the wood. "You really thought this through," she said, her voice carrying both admiration and something quieter, regret. "I believed in the arrangement we made," Boone answered, though even as he spoke he wondered which arrangement he meant, the one forged through months of letters, or the one that was unfolding now, unbidden, inevitable. Ruby's shoulders seemed to sag under a burden she had been holding too long. In the softer light, the exhaustion she had concealed revealed itself, dark circles shadowing her eyes, tension pulling at the corners of her mouth. "Violet never wanted this," she said suddenly, the words like stones dropping into still water. "Not from the beginning." The admission struck Boone with the force of a blow, yet he did not let it show. His jaw tightened, his breath even. Then why agree? Why write those words, those promises? Because she was desperate. Because I convinced her it was the only way. Ruby sank into the chair, her hands clasped in her lap, trembling slightly. "Our father's death left us ruined, debts that could have swallowed everything. She was young, frightened, and I thought I could protect her. So I wrote. I became the woman you thought you knew. It was my words, my hopes, my dreams you held in your hands." Her voice broke, and when she looked up, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I created someone who didn't exist, Boone." "And you fell in love with her." The truth tore through him, yet as he looked at her, this woman who had deceived him, and yet stood before him raw, trembling, beautiful in her courage, he realized the heart behind the letters had always been real. It had always been hers. He moved to the window, needing distance, his gaze lost in the darkening valley. But the silence stretched too long, and at last he turned back, his eyes locking with hers. "Where is she now?" he asked. Ruby hesitated, her lips parting, but no sound came. Finally her voice emerged, low and fragile. 3 days ago, a man came to her. Marcus Dalton, a man from her past. He told her lies about you, Boone. Told her you had wives before her, that you sold women into mining camps. He showed her photographs, documents, proof that terrified her. She believed him. Rage flared in Boone's chest, hot and unrelenting. Yet beneath it was something colder, sharper. The memory of a name that had once been poison. Dalton, a partner turned traitor, a man who had already destroyed once before. Ruby's hands tightened into fists. She ran with him. But I came here to warn you. Whatever he wants, this isn't over. And I think we're both in danger. Boone moved closer, studying the fear in her eyes, the tremor in her voice. He believed her, not because her words were flawless, but because the truth of them vibrated like a chord that could not be silenced. What did he look like? He pressed. Her description painted Dalton clearly in Boone's mind. Grey hair, young face, the chill in his eyes, every detail cut deeper into old scars. And when she spoke his name aloud, the wound reopened, raw and aching. Boone's fists clenched at his sides, his body taut with restrained fury. But Ruby was not finished. Her voice trembled as she revealed the final piece. When Violet left, she took something, a letter. She read it over and over. Whatever it said, it frightened her even more than Dalton's stories. The truth unfurled before them like a storm breaking across the valley. Betrayal, secrets, danger gathering on every horizon. Ruby's eyes sought his, wide with both fear and fierce determination. "We're not safe, neither of us." Outside, the sound of hoofbeats echoed faintly through the evening air, the rhythm of fate drawing closer. Boone turned toward the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Ruby stepped beside him, her presence steady, her warmth grounding him even as the world threatened to fall apart. He felt her closeness like a balm against the rage boiling inside him, like a whisper of healing in the storm. And in that moment, with shadows lengthening across the land and danger approaching, Boone knew this was no longer about arrangements or broken promises. It was about survival. It was about truth. It was about the unexpected bond forming between them. Fragile, dangerous, yet more real than anything he had ever known. Together they would face whatever came, and together they would discover whether love could grow from betrayal, whether healing could rise from wounds carved deep by lies and loss. The night pressed close around the ranch, shadows spilling like ink across the valley as the hoofbeats grew louder, deliberate, carrying the weight of unseen intentions. Ruby stood beside Boone at the window, her green eyes reflecting the lantern glow, her breath steady, though he could sense the storm trembling beneath her calm. He had faced threats before, men who wanted his land, rivals in business, storms that broke fences and scattered cattle. But this was different. This was betrayal with a human face, an old wound come back to strike him where he was most vulnerable. The riders came into view, 3 figures cutting through the dusk with purposeful strides. The lead horse carried a man Boone recognized instantly. The black mare with the white blaze had been tied at the trading post countless times. Sheriff Morrison. For years Boone had trusted the man, leaned on him as an ally in settling disputes and building a foothold in this hard land. But now, as Morrison dismounted, flanked by 2 men whose hands lingered too near their weapons, dread coiled low in Boone's chest. "Evening, Boone," Morrison called, his voice heavy with official weight. "Need to have a word with you." Boone stepped out onto the porch, Ruby close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm, the warmth of her nearness steadying him. He felt her presence like a thread of healing, binding his frayed edges, urging him to stay grounded. "What's this about, Sheriff?" The answer fell like a hammer, a warrant for his arrest. Fraud, theft, conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Dalton's lies had found fertile ground, and Morrison's voice carried the finality of law. Ruby stepped forward, chin raised, fire blazing in her eyes. "I'm Violet's sister. She's not missing. She left of her own will." But Morrison's reply was practiced, careful, as though rehearsed. Dalton had filed complaints, produced witnesses, spun his web so tightly that even the law bowed beneath it. And Boone, standing on his own porch, felt the walls of his world closing in. Ruby's hand touched his arm lightly, a fleeting gesture that carried more comfort than words. "What if I told you I could prove Marcus Dalton has been planning this for months?" she said, her voice cutting through the thick air. Morrison's jaw tightened, but his silence spoke volumes. There was more here than duty. There were secrets threading the sheriff to Dalton like twine around a snare. And then Ruby revealed her weapon, not steel, but truth. A small leather journal, worn at the edges, filled with careful entries. She had been listening, watching, recording. Dates, meetings, conversations between Morrison and Dalton, all etched in her steady hand. For months she had been invisible, moving through hotel kitchens and shadowed corridors, gathering the evidence that now threatened to unravel everything. Morrison's face paled, his authority faltering as she read aloud, her voice unwavering. Every word struck like a chisel against stone. Meetings at the Silver Dollar Hotel, discussions of Boone's contracts, of Violet, of schemes meant to frame an innocent man. The federal marshal who had ridden with Morrison leaned forward, interest sharpening his gaze, suspicion flickering into conviction. Morrison's denial rang hollow, sweat glistening on his brow. Boone watched it all with a mixture of awe and fury. Ruby, this woman who had deceived him, who carried secrets that could break them both, was now his fiercest defender, her courage shining like a lantern in the dark. And as the sheriff's mask cracked, as truth clawed its way into the open, Boone felt something shift deep within him. The anger that had burned since her confession began to soften, replaced by a respect that rooted itself like oak, steady and undeniable. But Morrison was not a man to surrender quietly. His hand twitched toward his gun, the night bristling with sudden danger. Ruby moved before Boone could react, tugging him aside just as the weapon cleared its holster. The gunshot shattered glass, echoing across the valley like thunder, but its mark missed. In the chaos, Ruby pressed something small and cold into Boone's palm. A key. Her voice was fierce but low. The barn. Violet left something there. Proof. You need to see it. The federal marshal wrestled Morrison to the ground, the other rider struggling to calm his spooked horse. In the confusion, Boone and Ruby slipped into the shadows, their breaths quick, their hands finding each other in the dark. The key bit into his palm, a promise of answers hidden beneath the weight of wood and hay. As they moved through the night, the barn looming ahead, Boone's heart pounded with more than fear. Ruby's hand fit against his with a naturalness that startled him, her strength flowing into him like healing water, steadying his every step. Danger surrounded them, betrayal coiled tight. But in her touch was something unbreakable, something that whispered of hope even in the darkest of nights. Together they would open what had been locked, and in doing so unlock not only Violet's fate, but their own. The path ahead was shadowed, but Boone no longer doubted. Whatever storm awaited them, he would face it with Ruby by his side. The barn loomed in the silver wash of moonlight, its weathered boards rising like a sentinel over the valley. Boone's breath came fast, not from the short sprint across the yard, but from the weight of everything pressing in. The warrant, Dalton's lies, Morrison's betrayal. And yet, beside him, Ruby's hand stayed firm in his, a steady pulse of warmth that calmed the storm raging inside. He could feel her strength as though it bled into him, healing the cracks left by shock and anger, whispering that even in the darkness, not all was lost. Inside, the air smelled of hay and leather, familiar scents that should have soothed him, but now carried a sharper edge. Shadows gathered thick in the corners as he lit a lantern, its glow spilling soft gold across wooden beams. Ruby moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the stalls, the shelves, the piles of tools and tack. She led him toward the far end, where an old trunk sat half hidden beneath blankets. "This," she said, her voice low but certain. The key in Boone's palm slid easily into the small lock he had never noticed before. With a twist, the trunk opened, and what lay inside made his heart seize. Letters, dozens of them, addressed not to Violet, nor to him, but to Marcus Dalton. Different hands, different towns, names Boone recognized. Morrison, a judge, a mayor, a railroad man, and beneath them photographs, terrible, intimate images of women, bruised and crying. "These are his tools," Ruby whispered, her face pale but her eyes steady. "Blackmail, lies, corruption. He's been weaving this web for years." Boone's hands trembled as he lifted the stack. The weight of it was more than paper. It was evidence of a rot that reached deep, beyond his ranch, beyond even Violet. "She found this?" he asked, his voice raw. Ruby nodded, tears glistening at the corners of her eyes. "Violet discovered everything when she confronted Dalton. That's why she ran. Not because she believed his stories about you, but because she realized how dangerous he truly is. But she didn't run free. He has Thomas." Her voice broke, her hands clenching tight. "Our brother. He's only 14. Dalton took him, Boone. Told Violet he'd kill the boy if she didn't obey." The world stilled, every sound falling away except the pounding of Boone's own heart. Fury ripped through him, cold and sharp, but beneath it was a deeper ache. The image of a frightened boy held captive, used as a chain to break a sister's will. He closed the trunk with a heavy thud, his jaw tight. "Where did they go?" Ruby wiped at her tears, pulling a folded scrap from the letters. "She left me this. A place. Miller's Canyon. 20 miles north. Dalton's hideaway." The name struck Boone like a blow. A remote stretch of land, federal territory, a place where no law held sway. Perfect for a man like Dalton. He met Ruby's gaze, saw the fire in her eyes mingled with grief, and felt something shift inside him. He had been drawn to her from the first moment, against his will, against reason. But now, standing in the golden glow of the lantern, surrounded by the proof of Dalton's corruption, he knew their fates were bound together. And outside, the night stirred with movement. Marshal Chen's voice rang across the yard, orders sharp and urgent. They slipped from the barn, carrying the evidence, their steps quick but sure. The marshal's eyes widened as Ruby placed the letters in his hands, his expression darkening with every page he read. "This changes everything," he muttered. "The charges against you, Boone, they're nothing but smoke. But this is fire. Dalton's reaching into the courts, the railroad, even the law itself. We have to move now." "I'm going with you," Boone said without hesitation. His voice carried the strength of roots sunk deep into the earth. Ruby stepped forward, her chin lifted, her voice clear despite the tremor of exhaustion. "And me. I know Dalton's ways. I've seen his habits, his routines. Violet trusts me. She won't believe she's safe unless I'm there." Chen hesitated, his gaze flicking between them, weighing risk against necessity. But the resolve in Ruby's eyes was unshakable. She had already faced storms that would have broken others, and she stood now with the fierce grace of someone who had nothing left to fear but losing those she loved. Boone looked at her then, really looked, and the world seemed to pause around them. He saw not just the deception of the letters, not just the burden of her guilt, but the woman herself, brave, flawed, unyielding, and beautiful in a way that seared itself into his heart. Reaching out, he took her hand, his fingers brushing hers with a tenderness that spoke of promises not yet made but already alive between them. "After this," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion, "when Violet and Thomas are safe, I need you to know what I feel. It's real, Ruby. It's not about letters or arrangements. It's you." Her breath caught, her lips parting as though to protest, but the truth was there in her eyes, shining through the cracks of her defenses. Slowly, she turned her hand to intertwine with his, her touch firm, her voice barely a whisper. "I know. I feel it too." The marshal's orders broke the moment. Men preparing horses, gathering rifles, the night alive with urgency. But even as they readied for danger, Boone held on to that single truth, warm and steady, a healing flame against the darkness. He had not fallen for a ghost, but for the living, breathing woman at his side. And whatever waited in Miller's Canyon, they would face it together. Miller's Canyon stretched before them like a wound carved deep into the earth, the towering cliffs swallowing light, the silence pressing heavy on every breath. Dawn had barely broken when Boone, Ruby, and Marshal Chen arrived at the ridge, their horses restless beneath the weight of tension. From their vantage, they saw the heart of Dalton's operation. The main cabin crouched low against the valley wall, two smaller outbuildings scattered like shadows, and guards moving with careless confidence. Smoke curled from a chimney, rising pale against the morning sky, indifferent to the lives trapped within. Ruby's eyes swept the scene with a steady precision, her hand shading her brow. "There," she whispered, pointing toward the smallest cabin with barred windows. Through the slats of wood, faint movement stirred. A glimpse of Violet, her hair unkempt, her arms wrapped protectively around a younger boy. Thomas. The sight of him lit something fierce in Ruby's chest, a flood of relief and sorrow mingling in her gaze. Boone saw the tremor in her hand, the way her breath caught, and without thinking he reached across, his palm warm against hers. She steadied instantly, drawing strength from his touch, and though neither spoke, the bond between them deepened, silent and unbreakable. Marshal Chen laid out the plan in hushed tones. Boone and Chen would strike the guards at the front. Ruby would slip to the hostage cabin, free Violet and Thomas, and bring them to safety. It was a plan written with risk in every line, but there was no hesitation. Their fates had already been bound by necessity, and the love rising quietly between them gave each step a weight that felt like destiny. The signal came, a hawk's cry echoing against stone, and the world erupted. Boone's rifle spoke first, a guard collapsing before the man could raise alarm. Chen's shot followed, sharp and precise. The third guard bolted toward the main cabin, shouting warnings, but Boone was already descending the ridge, boots cutting through gravel, his body driven by purpose. Bullets cracked in the morning air, the sting of gunpowder mixing with dust and fear. Ruby ran swift and silent, her skirts catching against rocks, her breath ragged but her heart steady. She reached the barred cabin, fumbling with the heavy lock before pressing Morrison's stolen key into the rusted iron. The door groaned open, and in the half-light she found Violet and Thomas huddled together, eyes wide with terror. "Ruby!" Violet sobbed, throwing herself into her sister's arms. He told me you were dead. Dalton said I'm here." Ruby cut in gently, her hand smoothing over Violet's tangled hair, her voice a healing balm against panic. "You're safe now, both of you. We're getting you out." She cut their bonds quickly, her hands trembling as Thomas clutched her waist, his young face pale but resolute. "I knew you'd come," he whispered, and the words lodged in her heart like a prayer answered. But danger was never far. Even as she led them toward the open air, gunfire exploded from the main cabin. Through the broken doorframe, she saw Boone and Chen locked in battle, exchanging fire with Dalton and one of his men. And then Dalton himself broke from the fight, his face twisted with rage, his rifle raised as he charged toward the hostage cabin. "Get behind me!" Ruby ordered, pushing Violet and Thomas to the floor. She raised the pistol Boone had pressed into her hand hours before, her grip firm despite the thunder of her pulse. Dalton's shadow filled the doorway, his voice a snarl. "You've ruined everything, but I'll finish what I started." Ruby didn't falter. She fired once, twice. The shot struck true, driving Dalton backward, his weapon clattering uselessly to the dirt. He staggered, hatred burning in his eyes even as life drained away, and then collapsed in the dust, silence swallowing his final breath. For a heartbeat, Ruby stood frozen, her chest heaving, the pistol still raised. Then Boone was there, bursting through the smoke, his eyes locking on hers with a flood of relief so fierce it nearly broke him. "It's over," she whispered, lowering the pistol as he pulled her into his arms. Violet clung to Thomas, sobbing with relief, and for the first time in what felt like endless months, Ruby allowed herself to breathe. Boone's embrace was solid, grounding, a promise unspoken, yet undeniable. His voice came low against her hair. "You saved them. You saved us all." 6 months later, the memory of that canyon lay like a scar, healed but never forgotten. The ranch was whole again, the wildflowers Ruby had planted blooming bright around the porch. Violet had married a kind teacher in town, her laughter free of shadows, her belly round with the promise of new life. Thomas thrived under Boone's guidance, learning the rhythms of ranch work, his boyish strength shaping into manhood. And Ruby moved through it all with quiet grace, her heart finally unburdened, her spirit steady. One golden evening, Boone stood on the porch, watching her tend the garden she had claimed as her own. The sky burned with colors of fire and honey, the air alive with the scent of earth after rain. "Mrs. Carter," he called, the title warm and reverent on his lips. Ruby straightened, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly, her smile radiant as she turned toward him. What had begun as deception had become something greater, a love born from broken promises and hardened by storms, yet healed by truth and tenderness. The wrong sister had stepped from that wagon, but she had stepped into the right life, a life woven with devotion, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of two souls who had found each other when they least expected it. And as Boone reached for Ruby's hand, leading her inside, the evening closed around them like a blessing, whispering that sometimes the most beautiful beginnings come disguised as mistakes. The seasons turned softly on the ranch, each day layering new colors onto the canvas of their lives. Where once the land had been scarred by suspicion, betrayal, and danger, now it pulsed with renewal, a rhythm steady and healing as spring rivers. Ruby's laughter filled the valley, bright as birdsong after rain, and the home Boone had built for a stranger became the sanctuary where two hearts found their true belonging. She tended the garden with hands that once trembled under the weight of secrets, now steady, shaping blossoms that opened toward the sun. He worked the fields with strength tempered by patience, every furrow carved not just for survival, but for the family that grew under his roof. Violet, freed from the shadows of her past, walked lighter now, her smile unburdened, her hand joined with the young teacher who adored her. The small home they built in town was always open, always filled with voices, with dreams stretching farther than fear. Thomas thrived under Boone's watchful guidance, his boyhood tempered into the first shape of manhood, his spirit learning resilience and grace. He carried in him the hope of generations, proof that no cruelty, no betrayal could steal the promise of a future when love stood guard. And Ruby was the heart of it all. The woman who had stepped from a wagon under the weight of lies had shed every chain, every shadow. At night, as she stood on the porch, the stars spread endless across the sky. She would feel Boone's arms circle her waist, his voice warm against her ear. "You were never a mistake," he would whisper, and she believed it now, with all the quiet certainty of roots that hold against any storm. She had walked into a life meant for someone else, but found the life that had been waiting for her all along. The wrong sister, the wrong plan, the wrong truth. Yet from it came the right love, the right family, the right future. Inside the home, lamplight painted golden halos across wood and stone, softening every edge. Ruby's belly curved gently beneath her dress, a promise of new life resting within her, the final healing thread woven through their story. Boone would kneel sometimes, pressing his ear close, listening for the faint kick of their child, his hands reverent as though cradling a miracle. And Ruby, watching him, felt her heart swell with a tenderness so deep it hurt. She knew this was the love she had never dared to dream of, the kind that turned every scar into a place where light could enter. The valley carried their story in whispers. The tale of a rancher accused, a woman who arrived in her sister's stead, a fight against lies that reached higher than law. But more than that, it carried the truth of love unexpected, a love that bloomed not in perfection, but in imperfection, not in certainty, but in risk. The kind of love that teaches patience, forgiveness, and the healing power of simply being seen. And when neighbors passed by, when they shared bread or lent a hand during harvest, they felt it too. The warmth that radiated from Boone and Ruby, a light that turned an ordinary ranch into a home blessed by grace. One evening, as the sun folded itself into the hills and the sky blushed with fire and violet hues, Boone and Ruby stood together on the porch. Her head rested against his shoulder, his arm curved strong and gentle around her. Silence lingered between them, not empty but full, a silence that spoke of all they had endured, all they had become. In that moment, they were not the rancher and the deceiver, not the betrayed and the betrayer. They were simply two souls who had found their way home to each other. Love, after all, is not always what we expect. Sometimes it arrives disguised as loss, sometimes as mistake, sometimes as pain. But when it is true, it heals, it roots deep, it grows stronger with every storm. Ruby and Boone had walked through fire, through shadows, through lies, and what remained was something pure, enduring, eternal. If this story touched your heart, let its warmth linger a little longer. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here. And if you felt comfort in its healing light, I invite you to gently press like, to subscribe, to stay with us as we continue to tell stories that carry love through the storms and into the calm. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the wrong beginning can lead us to the most beautiful ending of all.